In Romans chapter 15, verse 8, the Apostle Paul writes, "Now I say that Jesus Christ was a minister to the circumcision to confirm the promises made to the fathers, and that the Gentiles might glorify God for his mercy." And in a strange way, we're going to see that acted out here as Jesus is arrested and taken to trial before Pontius Pilate. Hey friends, welcome back to Understanding Your Bible. My name is Jim, and this is what we hope to be an informal, virtual, home-style Bible study. It's my desire that we imagine ourselves seated across this table from one another with our Bibles open before us, prayerfully sharing with one another what God would be saying to us through his word. Today we're continuing in our verse-by-verse study of the Gospel of John. Today we're in John 18, and we'll be starting in verse 10. If you remember last time, we took a lot of time looking at the physical and medical aspects of what someone experienced when they experienced a Roman scourging and crucifixion. And we did that to lend weight to what we're going to be reading in the next few chapters as we study the passion and the death of our Lord. So turn to John chapter 18. So far in John 18, we've seen Jesus and his disciples go to the Garden of Gethsemane. And we learned from the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, of the struggle that Jesus had there, praying to the Father while his disciples were asleep, struggling with asking the Father if there's any other way that this cup can pass, yet not my will, but your will be done. And the great stress he was under, so stressful that he was sweating blood. We saw the Roman cohort come to arrest him, and of course at the head of them was his friend Judas, who was betraying him. Jesus stepped forward to confront them and to initiate and to control the circumstances, and to offer himself as was planned from eternity past. And Simon Peter comes to himself and lashes out with his sword. So start in verse 10 of chapter 18. It says, "Simon Peter, therefore, having a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's slave and cut off his right ear. And the slave's name was Malchus." And I think, just incidentally, when you see somebody mentioned by name like that, I believe that similarly to Simon of Cyrene, who carried Jesus' cross, that means that person later on became a believer. And so that's why they're mentioned by name. Jesus will have none of it, and he tells Peter to put up the sword. In Matthew, he says that those who take up the sword will perish by the sword. And do you not think that in Matthew 26:52 and in 53, he says, "Do you not think I can appeal to my Father? He will not at once place at me more than 12 legions of angels." Then in Luke 22:51, it says that Jesus touched the man's ear and healed him, which was good because Peter could have been arrested also for assault. But the result is what Jesus wanted it to be and what was planned to be. And he says in verse 11, he says to Peter, back in John 18 now, Jesus said to Peter, "Put the sword into the sheath. The cup the Father has given me, shall I not drink it?" And again, referencing back to that struggle he had in Gethsemane, praying, can this cup pass? But the result is as what was planned. Verse 12, "So the Roman cohort and the commander and the officers of the Jews arrested Jesus and bound him." Now you're going to notice that Jesus is going to have several stages of his trial. A couple of Jewish trials by the Jewish authorities, and he's going to have a couple of Roman trials. We'll kind of draw your attention to each one of those as we go. But the first one, they're going to lead him to Annas. In verse 13 of John 18, it says, "And they led him to Annas first. He was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was the high priest that year." Now we know from history that Annas was high priest and was deposed, and then his son-in-law Caiaphas became high priest. And you can compare this kind of to what happened in the Catholic Church several years ago when there was Pope Benedict, and he decided to retire and they elected the new pope, Pope Francis. And so at the same time, we had two popes, one pope, a Pope Emeritus, and the current reigning pope. And Benedict, although he didn't have the same position anymore, he still seemed to wield some influence. This was the same way here, although I think the power was a little bit more than we're talking with in that situation. Annas seemed to still wield a considerable amount of influence. So they took him to Annas first. Why? Maybe it was because of his influence. It also could have been because Caiaphas was still arranging matters, was still trying to get the Sanhedrin assembled, the false witnesses that they were trying to get and trump up these charges were. He was still working all the details out, and he wasn't quite ready yet. So they took him to Annas. And I believe I even read in one of the commentaries that their two residences may have just been in the same complex, just kind of separated by a big courtyard area. Then in verse 14 it says, "Now Caiaphas was the one who had advised the Jews that it was expedient for one man to die on behalf of the people." And it's been a while since we looked at that, so let's go back to look at that situation, because I think it's important to remember. That's back in John chapter 11. In John chapter 11, if you recall, is the story of Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead. And when that happened, of course, it was something that nobody could deny. He was dead in the tomb for over 4 days. And so the authorities had a real problem on their hands. And we see this in chapter 11. If you drop down to verse 47, we read, "Therefore the chief priests and the Pharisees convened a council and were saying, 'What are we doing? For this man is performing many signs. If we let him go on like this, all men will believe in him, and the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation.'" And you just have to think about the implications of what's being said here. So they're saying, we're seeing the signs that this man is doing. And those signs indicate that God is at work in his life. I'm not saying they're saying that, but that's what the signs are saying. The signs are clearly saying that. Remember what I read earlier, the Romans verse, that Jesus came to be a servant to the circumcision, to the Jews, to confirm the promises made to the Father. Back in Romans, I read that in Romans 15:8. And what were those promises? The promises made in Genesis chapter 3, the promises made in Genesis chapter 12 to Abraham, and then on to Isaac and Jacob and Moses and David and so on, all the patriarchs and the fathers. Those promises, he was coming to fulfill them. And in doing so, he was doing these signs to testify who he was. And so they're saying that, okay, we're observing that that's happening, and we believe that not that he's going to come and deliver us from the Romans, or kind of deliver us and bring upon us God's kingdom and rule on earth. And even if they did believe that, what they're saying is that the Romans won't put up with it, as if the Romans are stronger than God and are going to come and so the point of it is that they are more concerned about their political situation, their political position, than they are about the kingdom of God and what he's interested in. It's just fascinating to me that these men in such who were the religious authorities, were supposed to be the spiritual leaders, are working so vehemently against God here. And then in verse 49, it says, "But one of them, Caiaphas, who was high priest that year, said to them, 'You know nothing at all, nor do you take into account that it is expedient for you that one man die for the people, and that the whole nation not perish.'" And John, of course, in verse 51 points out that he did not say this on his own initiative, but being high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus was going to die for the nation. So even though he was doing this out of the evil of his heart and to protect his own position and their situation as the rulers, out of selfish ambition, God was speaking through him as high priest and saying the words that he intended to say, but God meant something much different. That Jesus was coming to take on the sin of the world, not for the nation only, in verse 52, but in order that he might also gather together into one the children of God who are scattered abroad. Okay, so back to chapter 18. So he's come to Annas. Verse 15 now. the scene switches back to Simon Peter. We know that from the Synoptics that once Jesus was arrested, they all fled. All the disciples fled from him. And we can imagine that Peter, and we'll see in a second that John as well, may have come to their senses and decided then to follow at a distance and see what was happening. So verse 15, Simon Peter was following Jesus, and so was another disciple. Now that disciple was known to the high priest and entered with Jesus into the court of the high priest. And this is talking about John. Almost without exception, most commentators believe that this is John is referring to himself here. And how would he might have known the high priest? Well, there's a couple of different things I read in commentaries. One, it could be that he, just as the Zebedee, his father, James and John, their father, they were all fishermen, and so they were businessmen. They may have had dealings with the household of the priest. There's also a possibility that John and Jesus were related through Mary's sister, on Mary's sister's side, and John may have had ties to John the Baptist's family as well, and been at least partially of some priestly lineage. So there could have been some sort of familial relation between them. But either way, however it is, it's not hard to imagine that he was familiar with the high priest's household and was able then, therefore, to gain entrance. So he said he was known to the high priest, again in verse 16. He went out, spoke to the doorkeeper, and brought in Peter. So it's like, you can imagine, ever seen a movie or on a TV show where this exclusive club, and you can't get in unless your name is on the list. Your name's been put on the list by the owner or the host. And so the man guarding the door is not going to let you in unless your name's on the list. Well, John's name was on the list. Verse 17, so after they went in, the slave girl who kept the door looked at Peter and said, "You're not also one of this man's disciples, are you?" And Peter fulfills the Lord's prophecy and denies it. It says, "I am not." Verse 18, it says, "Now the slaves and the officers were standing there, having made a charcoal fire, for it was cold, and they were warming themselves. And Peter also with them was standing and warming himself. The high priest therefore questioned Jesus about his disciples and about his teaching. And Jesus answered him and said," so this is Annas, remember, "I have spoken openly to the world. I've always taught in the synagogues and in the temple, where all the Jews come together. I spoke nothing in secret." And let's just pause there for a second and just notice, Jesus said he taught nothing in secret. So anytime you might see some fantastic video or see some book that's purporting to have some secret teaching of Jesus, not true. When Jesus taught, nothing was secret about his teaching. There's no underlying meaning to his words, no secret code to find out. Jesus taught nothing in secret. He is proclaiming his truth so that those who believe can understand it. Verse 21, "Why do you question me? Question those who've heard, and I spoke to them, and behold, these know what I said." And when he had said this, one of the officers standing by gave Jesus a blow. He struck him. "Is this the way you answer the high priest?" Jesus, verse 23, answered him and said, "If I've spoken wrongly, bear the witness of the wrong. But if rightly, why do you strike me?" Again, Jesus invites people to show where he is in error or he has sinned, and nobody can bring a charge against him for any reason. Verse 24, Annas therefore sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. And at this point, we have to shift to see what happens next to the synoptics. And in this case, we'll go with Mark, because Mark, unlike other places in Mark, where Mark is very brief with detail and just gives us the bare facts, here he goes into the most detail of all of them. So in Mark chapter 14, verse 53, he says, "And they led Jesus away to the high priest, and all the chief priests and the elders and the scribes gathered together." Now they're going to Caiaphas. Verse 54, "And Peter had followed them at a distance, right into the courtyard of the high priest, and was sitting with the officers and warming himself at the fire. Now the chief priests," and again, this could have been two separate residences separated by the same courtyard. Verse 55, now the chief priests and the whole council kept trying to obtain testimony against Jesus to put him to death, but they were not finding any. For many were giving false testimony against him, and yet their testimony was not consistent. Verse 57, and some stood up and began to give false testimony against him, saying, we heard him say, I will destroy this temple made with hands, and in 3 days I will build another, not another made without hands. And of course, this refers back to the beginning of John's Gospel, and other places. I think he said that I think it's John chapter 2, and after he had cleansed the temple the first time, if you go, they ask him, why are you doing these things? What sign do you show us to show us your authority for doing these things? That's in John 2:18. And verse 19, Jesus gives the answer. He says, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. And so, of course, John clarifies that he's talking about the temple of his body. And they were not getting that right. But that had been something that stuck with people. And it was repeated. And people remembered, if at all, if only incorrectly, what he had said. Verse 59, and even in this respect, their testimony was inconsistent. Verse 60, the high priest now stood up and came forward and questioned Jesus, saying, do you make no answer? What is it that these men are testifying against you? But he kept silent and made no answer. Again, the high priest was questioning him, saying to him, and said to him, are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One? Verse 62, Jesus said, I am. And you shall see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven. Quoting, referencing Psalm 110 and Daniel chapter 7, those talking about the Son of Man, which I think we've mentioned before, this messianic and divine figure that is in Daniel, who approaches the Ancient of Days and receives from him power and glory and authority and dominion. So that's who Jesus is referencing himself to. And of course, that is enough. And verse 63, and tearing his clothes, the high priest said, what further need do we have of witnesses? You've heard the blasphemy. How does it seem to you? And they all condemned him to be deserving of death. And some began, verse 65, to spit at him and to blindfold him and to beat him with their fists and to say to him, prophesy. And the officers received him with slaps in the face. Verse 66, going back outside now. It says, and as Peter was below the courtyard, one of the servant girls of the high priest came, and seeing Peter warming himself, she looked at him and said, you too were with Jesus, the Nazarene. But he denied it, saying, I neither know nor understand what you are talking about. And he went out onto the porch. Verse 69, and the maid saw him and began once more to say to the bystanders, this is one of them. But he began denying it. And after a little while, the bystanders were saying again to Peter, surely you are one of them, for you are Galilean too. But then he began to curse and swear, I do not know this man you're talking about. And immediately a cock crowed a second time. And in Luke chapter 22, in verse 61, we get the detail that the Lord, through an open window, whatever, he and Jesus make eye contact. And verse 61, it says, and the Lord turned and looked at Peter, and Peter remembered the word of the Lord, how he had told him, behold, before a cock crows today, you will deny me 3 times. And he went out and wept bitterly. And of course, Peter won't recover from this until the resurrected Jesus asks him 3 questions. Next in the Synoptics, we get the scene of what happens to Judas after all this plays out. And it's been that they've decided to put him to death. In Matthew 27, 3 through 10, we read, then when Judas, who had betrayed him, saw that he had been condemned, felt remorse, and returned the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and the elders, saying, I have sinned, betraying innocent blood. But they said, what is that to us? See to that yourself. And he threw the pieces of silver into the sanctuary and departed, went away, and hanged himself. Then both in this account, and then the book of Acts, it also mentions that the money was used to buy a field, which was used for burying strangers. Now returning to John chapter 18, and we're in verse 28 now. They led Jesus, therefore, from Caiaphas into the praetorium, and it was early, and they themselves did not enter into the praetorium in order that they might not be defiled, but might eat the Passover. So here these guys they're trying to railroad Jesus into being put to death, falsely accusing him, committing murder, basically, and they're worried about ceremonial ritual purity. Amazing. Verse 29, Pilate therefore went out to them and said, "What accusation do you bring against this man?" And then if we cut over to Luke chapter 23, verse 2, we hear the answer. And they began to accuse him, saying, "We found this man misleading our nation, and forbidding." And they began to accuse him, saying, "We found this man misleading our nation, and forbidding to pay taxes to Caesar, and saying that he himself is Christ, a king." You've heard of two truths and a lie? Well, this is two lies and a truth. Back to John, verse 31 of 18. Pilate therefore said to them, "Take him yourselves, and judge him according to your law." The Jews said to him, "We are not permitted to put anyone to death." Verse 32, that the word of Jesus might be fulfilled, which he spoke, signifying by what kind of death he was about to die. And Jesus said back in John chapter 3 that the Son of Man must be lifted up. And he was talking about his death by crucifixion. And that's what is being referred to here. Verse 33, Pilate therefore entered again into the praetorium and summoned Jesus and said to him, "Are you king of the Jews?" So they had made a political accusation against insurrection, which is something that Pilate had to deal with. Had it been just a religious matter, Pilate could have just said, "Deal with it. I don't want to be bothered." But since they had raised it to the level of insurrection and accusing him of being a threat to Rome, to Caesar's authority, Pilate has to engage. So he asks him, "Are you king of the Jews?" And Jesus does something very interesting here. Verse 34, he answered and said, "Are you saying this on your own initiative, or did others tell you about me?" I like the way the NLT puts it. It says, is this your own question? Whereas here it says, are you saying this on your own initiative, or did others tell you about me? And NLT says, "Is this your own question?" And so basically, it seems that Jesus is going after Pilate's heart. Are you seeing something in me that is causing you to ask this question, or are you just going off of what others have told you about me? And of course, it's the latter. Verse 35, Pilate answered, "I'm not a Jew, am I? Your own nation and the chief priest delivered you up to me. What have you done?" Verse 36, Jesus answers this question. "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, then my servants would be fighting, that I might not be delivered to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not of this realm." So in other words, he's saying, I am no threat to you. I am no threat to you. But Pilate grabbed onto this. He was looking for something he could grab onto, so he grabbed onto this. Pilate, therefore, verse 37, said to him, "So you are a king?" And Jesus answered, "You say correctly that I am a king. For this I have been born, and for this I have come into the world, to bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth hears my voice." And Pilate said to him, "What is truth?" So he went out to the Jews and said to them, "I find no guilt in him." And so that's the first pronouncement that Jesus is innocent. And we'll see several more before we're done. Well, let's pause it there, friends, and we'll continue next time. Friends, let me know what you're thinking as we study the suffering, the arrest and the suffering and the rejection of Jesus by his own people, by the Romans. Let me know what your thoughts are in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. And then if you appreciate this kind of content on YouTube, I'd appreciate it if you click that like button and subscribe to the channel. It really does help get the channel out in front of more people. And we want those who are interested in studying the Bible in this way to be able to find this channel and for it to grow. And I always pray at the beginning before I start each video to God, use this for their good and your glory. And so that's what we want. Pray alongside me in that. I'd appreciate that. Again, friends, thanks for watching, and we'll see you here next time and continue in the Gospel of John here on Understanding Your Bible. Thanks.